My name is Jorge Mario Bergoglio, but most people now know me as Pope Francis. I was born on the 17th of December, 1936, in a busy neighborhood of Buenos Aires. Back then, I was just Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the oldest of 5 kids. My parents, Mario and Regina, came to Argentina from Italy, hoping for a better life through honest work. From them, I didn't just get my last name. I learned how to live simply, work hard, and pray quietly before dinner. We didn't have much, but we had plenty of love. My grandmother, Rosa, taught me how to pray the rosary and told me stories about the saints. Her hands were rough from years of prayer, but they always led me gently toward God. I remember the smell of fresh bread on Sundays, the sound of tango music in the streets, the noisy city life, and the quiet moments where I felt closest to God. That was the world I grew up in. As a kid, I was pretty normal, loud, curious, and sensitive. I loved reading, especially the writings of Jorge Luis Borges. I studied chemistry and even thought I'd spend my life working in a lab. I taught psychology for a while too, which is kind of funny now, since I've spent most of my life trying to understand the human soul. But life changes us early sometimes. When I was 21, I got really sick with pneumonia. It was so bad they had to remove part of my lung. I was stuck between high fevers and desperate prayers, just trying to breathe. That illness made me weaker physically, but stronger inside. I started to feel like my life wasn't fully mine anymore, that maybe God had something planned for me. It was around then that I walked into a confessional. I wasn't expecting much, just the usual routine, but what I found there changed me. The priest, I don't even remember his name, showed me what God's mercy really feels like. That moment meant more to me than any book or lecture. It was then I felt called to become a Jesuit. I joined the Society of Jesus in 1958. Being a Jesuit taught me how to think deeply, to ask questions, and to really listen. The training was tough and long, but it was also full of meaning. We woke up before sunrise. We studied philosophy, theology, history, and each other's flaws. We spent weeks in silence, thinking hard about the Bible and about ourselves. That's when I first understood something the Jesuits call magis, always reaching for what brings more glory to God. I didn't learn humility from books. I learned it by messing up, by following orders, and by living with people who challenged me, just like I challenged them. I learned to listen not just with my ears, but with my heart. During those early years, I realized that real leadership doesn't come from power. It comes from serving others. I never thought I'd wear white robes or speak to millions, but even back then, I felt that God was asking me to love without holding back, to follow Him, even when it wasn't easy. I became a priest on the 13th of December, 1969. My hands were shaking when I lifted the host for the first time. The Eucharist, something so quiet, so simple, and so powerful, became the center of my life. I was no longer just Jorge from the neighborhood. I had become a servant at the altar. Even after I was sent to lead, to travel, to take on big responsibilities, I've always tried to stay that same young man who was changed by mercy, still trying to walk in its light. In 1973, I was 36, still young, still learning to breathe through prayer more than chasing goals. That year, I was named Provincial Superior of the Jesuits in Argentina. I didn't ask for the job, but I accepted it with shaky hands and a steady heart. In the Society of Jesus, obedience isn't a burden, it's a test. The church was heading into a storm, so was Argentina. Those were the years of the dirty war, La Guerra Sucia. My country was bleeding. People were disappearing. Fear was everywhere. I found myself caught in the middle, trying to protect the people under my care, while dealing with a government that crushed anything that didn't stay quiet. Two Jesuit priests I knew well, Orlando Yorio and Franz Jalix, were working in the slums, helping the poor. They were brave, but their way of doing things wasn't traditional. I worried. I thought they were in danger, and I feared the government would misunderstand them. I asked them to step back and get formal permission. They said no. Not long after, they were kidnapped, beaten, and tortured. I prayed non-stop for their safety. Thank God, they were eventually released, hurt, but alive. Still, the pain didn't go away. Over time, people started blaming me. Some said I hadn't done enough to help. Some said I betrayed them. I've carried their names in my heart ever since. I've asked God so many times, did I act too carefully? Was I too afraid? Did I protect them the best I could? Years later, when I met Franz again as Pope, we hugged. He forgave me. I forgave myself too, but the wound stayed. It became a space where grace entered. It reminded me that being a leader means not only being wise, but also being honest about when we fall short. After my time as provincial, I was sent into what I later called my internal exile. I became a rector for a while, then I was quietly removed. Some said I had been too strict. Others said Rome no longer trusted me. The truth is, I was broken. I had led with discipline, loyal to the church, but I had not loved well enough. My fellow Jesuits pulled away from me. So in 1990, I was sent to Cordoba. No preaching, no teaching, no title, just silence, a room, a breviary, a Bible. I lived in that small room for 2 years in a Jesuit house far from Buenos Aires. I heard confessions. I wrote reflections on the Passion of Christ. I swept floors, served meals, and prayed deep into the night. No one asked for my thoughts. No one expected me to come back. I called it my dark night. I didn't know it then, but that exile saved me. That's where I learned to let go of my own idea of how God should use me. That's where I realized how easy it is to confuse your own ego with God's will. I had led with confidence, but Cordoba taught me something better. To lead with humility, to speak from pain, not pride. Years later, when I became bishop, then cardinal, that darkness was still teaching me. It taught me not to aim higher, but to go lower, not to win, but to lose with grace. And in that loss, I saw Christ again, scarred, silent, and waiting for me. In 1992, God came knocking again. Out of the quiet of Cordoba, the call came. I was going to be named Auxiliary Bishop of Buenos Aires. I remember looking at myself in the mirror in my small room. The man staring back looked older, more serious, marked by failure and prayer. I didn't understand why God was calling me again. I didn't feel like I deserved it, but I said yes. From that day on, I made a choice. I wouldn't chase titles anymore. I wouldn't fall for the illusion of power. I would walk with my people as one of them. In 1998, after Cardinal Quaracino passed away, I became Archbishop of Buenos Aires. The city where I was born became the place I was asked to care for. But I didn't move into the fancy palace. I picked a small apartment downtown, close to the street. I made my own food. I rode the subway. I walked among commuters, tired moms, and men selling roses on the corner. Some people thought I was just trying to look humble, but I wasn't. That life helped me breathe. I got to know the city through its pain, the slums, the tight alleys, the hungry kids who couldn't focus in catechism class. I held mass in tin roof chapels. I knelt with mothers who had lost sons to gang violence. I heard confessions sitting on park benches. During those years, I kept saying something over and over. The church has to stay close to the people. A real shepherd should smell like the sheep. I wasn't a protester. I didn't march or chant. But I stood where the gospel told me to stand, next to the poor, the elderly, the migrants, the addicts, the pregnant teens, and the dads without jobs. I spoke up for the unborn and the forgotten, the disabled and the dying. I spoke out against corruption, softly but clearly, against fake holiness, against a church too scared of getting messy to open its doors. On the 21st of February, 2001, John Paul II made me a cardinal. I accepted the red hat with shaking hands, but I asked that there be no big celebration in Buenos Aires. I wanted the money to go to the poor instead. I never thought I'd go further than that. I loved Buenos Aires too much. It was the city of my childhood, my faith, my exile, and my return. I thought I would die there, in the early morning noise, the smell of incense in the neighborhoods, and the scent of coffee from the street carts. But God had bigger plans. It was February 2013, when everything changed. Pope Benedict XVI, the Pope before me, and my brother in Christ decided to resign. The whole world was shocked. So was I. No pope had stepped down by choice in 600 years. It was a powerful act of humility, one I would never forget. I went to Rome with only one goal: to pray and serve. A new conclave was coming. The Sistine Chapel would be closed, and cardinals from all over the world would gather to vote under Michelangelo's Last Judgment. I prepared myself to listen, to stay quiet, to follow the Spirit. But then, something happened. The ballots started to repeat one name, mine, first in whispers, then louder. Jorge Mario Bergoglio. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I was 76. I only had one lung, and I had spent most of my life far from the spotlight. But the name kept coming. Then Cardinal Claudio Hums leaned over and whispered, "Don't forget the poor." Those words hit me deeply. So I said yes, not because I wanted it, but because I was afraid to say no to God. I chose the name Francis, after Saint Francis of Assisi. He was a man of peace, simplicity, and love for nature. He heard God say, "Go, rebuild my church." No pope had ever picked that name. Maybe because it asks for everything. When I stepped out onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, I saw thousands of faces looking up at me. They were strangers, but they felt like my children. I didn't wear red or gold, just plain white. I bowed and said, "Pray for me." At that moment, I felt the weight of 2,000 years on my shoulders. I didn't feel powerful. I felt small. But I also felt held. My first days weren't about power or politics. I did small things. I went back to the guest house to pay my bill. I rode the minibus with the other cardinals. On Holy Thursday, I kissed the feet of prisoners, men and women, Muslims and atheists. I didn't just wash their feet, I washed away my fear. I chose not to live in the big apostolic palace. I stayed in a simple room at Casa Santa Marta, where I could eat with others, hear laughter, and remember I was not a king, I was a priest. I often said how I would love a church that is poor and for the poor. That wasn't just a slogan. It came from the deepest part of who I am, as a Jesuit. The church was tired, hurt by scandal, full of conflict. Sometimes, it felt more like a museum than a place of healing. I didn't come to fix it from above. I came to kneel beside it, to offer mercy, to say the name of Jesus again, where people had forgotten it. Change would come, but mercy had to come first. So I started walking, not with a plan or a map, but with the gospel and the smell of the sheep. I didn't come to change church teaching. I came to change its tone. From the start of my time as Pope, I knew the church needed change, not just in how it was run, but in how it cared for people. I brought together a small group of cardinals, not to praise me, but to be honest about what was broken. The Vatican had gotten too focused on itself, too caught up in power. I said the church shouldn't be run like a business. We should treat her like a mother, strong, forgiving, and close to her children. The church wasn't just struggling, it was hurting. Hurt by scandals, split by disagreements, frozen by fear of change. I didn't show up with a plan. I showed up with the gospel, and with memories of slums, crowded buses, and quiet confessions. I remembered how mercy helped me when I was young. I believed it could help the church too, so I didn't start with big announcements. I started with simple acts. I picked up the phone. One woman in Argentina had written to me. She had lost her husband and felt she couldn't pray anymore. I called her. I said, "Even if you can't find the words, just looking up to heaven is enough." Another time, I called a young girl who had been raped and was now pregnant. She cried. I listened. I told her she was not dirty. She was brave. God was with her. I didn't do these things to make headlines. I did them because I'm a priest, and I can't forget what pain looks like. Then came my first encyclical, Laudato Si. It was a letter to everyone, not just to Catholics. I wrote about how the earth, our shared home, is being hurt by greed and carelessness. I used the simple words of St. Francis of Assisi, the poor man who loved the sun, the soil, and every creature. I wrote, "The earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth." Some people said I shouldn't talk about climate change or fossil fuels, but I wasn't speaking as a politician. I was speaking as a father. I had seen kids drink dirty water and breathe poisoned air. I had seen people living in trash. The cry of the earth and the cry of the poor had become the same. I said, "Such an economy kills." And it does. It kills workers' dignity. It kills migrants' hopes. It kills the forests, the oceans, and the future of unborn children. Some called me a communist. They said I didn't understand economics. I smiled. I understand the gospel. That's enough. I asked the church to be what it's supposed to be, a field hospital after battle. Not a castle of rules, but a place where people come to be healed and loved. I told priests, "Go out, touch the wounded, smell like the sheep." I called the synod on the family. I told bishops to listen, not just to each other, but to divorced couples, single moms, broken families, and all kinds of love that didn't follow the rules but still showed God's touch. For this, some called me a heretic. 4 cardinals sent me their dubia, questions pretending to ask about doctrine, but really trying to accuse me. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because sometimes silence says more than words. They wanted black and white answers. I offered mercy. They wanted rules. I offered wisdom. They said I was opening dangerous doors. I said Christ wasn't afraid of doors. He knocked. He went into homes others stayed away from. He ate with sinners and shocked the religious leaders. One night, during the pandemic, I stood alone in St. Peter's Square. Rain fell like tears. The world was quiet. No crowds, no singing, just sirens and sorrow. I raised the Blessed Sacrament and prayed for a world full of fear. It wasn't a show of power. It was a cry for help. We had all been brought low. Maybe now we would finally listen. The reform kept going, slowly, imperfectly. I changed the curia. I pushed for justice in abuse cases. I made sure the church's finances were watched more closely. But none of it would matter if we didn't become the church we were meant to be, a mother, a helper, a light in the dark. I didn't want a perfect church. I wanted a church with bruises. A church that had gone out into the streets and gotten hurt while loving others. And I knew, the deeper the wound, the more room there is for grace. If there was one burden I could never put down, it was this: the sexual abuse of children by men who were supposed to be fathers in Christ. It left a deep scar on the church's face. I didn't cause this crisis. I inherited it. It was already there, buried under years of silence, denial, and fear. But just because I didn't start it doesn't mean I could ignore it. From the moment I became Pope, I knew this wasn't just a scandal. It was a betrayal of innocence, trust, and the message of the gospel. Even knowing that, I made mistakes. I think about Chile often. I appointed Bishop Juan Barros, who was accused of covering up abuse, even though survivors begged me not to. I believed what I was told. I trusted too quickly. And when I went to Chile in 2018, I said the victims were lying. I didn't stop to think about the weight of my words until after I had already spoken them. But then the weight hit me. Hard. A survivor gave me a letter I should have read much earlier. It told the truth, and that truth burned deep into my heart. When I got back to Rome, I cried. I asked the Chilean bishops to come to the Vatican. I listened to them. I asked them to resign. But more than that, I asked for forgiveness, out loud, with no excuses. Not just from the victims in Chile, but from everyone who had been hurt while the church failed to protect them. I made changes. I removed the pontifical secret rule for abuse cases. I created a system called Vos Estis to hold bishops responsible. I met survivors face to face, not for news headlines, but to help them heal. They told me stories I'll never forget. A child praying while being hurt. A mother who lost her faith the day the church ignored her. A priest who only admitted what he did when it was too late. Every story felt like another step on the way to the cross. Some people say, I didn't do enough. Maybe they're right. When justice is delayed, it's like justice never came, and no apology can erase the past. But I tried. I tried to make the church a safer place. Not perfect, but more honest. Less secretive. Less proud. I often thought about St. Peter. He denied Jesus with his words too. He cried, just like I did. But even after that, Jesus told him to keep caring for his people. Still, when I looked at the crucifix in my chapel at Santa Marta, I sometimes whispered, Lord, what do you want from me? How do I carry the weight of so many sins? In those moments, I didn't feel like the Pope. I felt like a broken man, held together by grace and the prayers of the people. I met victims in Philadelphia, Dublin, Santiago, and Rome. I didn't talk. I just listened. When they cried, I cried too. Here in the Vatican, there's a temptation to treat pain like a problem to manage, to delay, to spin, to make it sound better than it is. But pain isn't something you fix with a strategy. You carry it. Even now, I still see their faces. The boy who handed me a letter after Mass, his hands shaking. The woman who hadn't been in a church for 30 years, but came just to say, I want you to know what happened to me. I carry those faces with me, like the wounds of Christ, not healed, not forgotten. And in their pain, I remember. The gospel isn't a palace. It's a wound that tells the truth. I used to say that Benedict's resignation in 2013 was a brave decision, but I didn't really understand how much it cost until I became Pope myself. He didn't step down to run away. He stepped down because he was humble enough to admit the church needed a strength he no longer had. By doing that, he made space for something totally new. A church with two popes in white, one leading, one praying quietly. We were very different. He was a quiet scholar from Bavarian libraries. I was a pastor from the poor neighborhoods of Buenos Aires. He spoke theology like poetry. I often struggled, using actions more than words, but we had deep respect for each other. Some people tried to set us against each other. They were worried about the changes I was bringing and saw him as a symbol of tradition and caution. But Benedict never fed that kind of thinking. In private, he was always kind, supportive, and prayerful. When I visited him at the Mater Ecclesiae monastery, he welcomed me with warmth and gentle laughter. He gave advice when I asked, and gave me space when I needed it. He once told me, "Holiness is never comfortable, but it's the only thing that matters." I never forgot that. Over time, my body started to slow down. My legs got stiff. Breathing became harder. I had surgery, then walked with a cane, then used a wheelchair. People watched me struggle to walk across marble floors. I kept smiling, but inside, I felt how fragile I was. Still, I didn't want to step back. I went to Iraq, where bombs had once stopped church bells. I kissed the hands of Muslim leaders. I stood in the ruins of Mosul and called for peace, not as politics, but as prayer. I visited Africa, the Americas, Asia, places full of pain and hope. Each trip reminded me I wasn't alone. The church was still alive, not in grand buildings, but in small villages, refugee camps, favelas, deserts. Slowly, I began to talk more about death, not in a sad way, but like seeing an old friend waiting at the door. I once wrote, "Old age is a time of grace. It's a time to remember, to let go, to learn how to be small again." I had once lived quietly in Cordoba, mostly forgotten. Now, I was preparing for another silence, one I wouldn't return from. People asked if I would resign like Benedict. I answered honestly, "When the time comes, I'll know." But I also knew that you can't rush a decision like that. Being Pope isn't like taking off a coat. It's a wound. It's a witness. It's a promise. So I prayed. I prayed for the world, for young people who lost faith, for older people who lost strength, for victims who lost trust, and for leaders who lost their way. I prayed for those who loved the church and those who had been hurt by her. I wasn't afraid of death. I only feared failing the poor, the suffering, the forgotten. In quiet moments, I thought about the streets of Flores, my grandmother Rosa's prayers, the cold floor in Cordoba, the faces of prisoners, mothers, bishops, widows. I asked myself, did I love enough? Did I listen? Did I always point people to Christ, not to myself? I never wanted a statue. I only hoped people would remember me as a shepherd who kept walking. Even if limping, even if late, even if imperfect, still walking. In my last few months, life slowed down. I still woke up early. I still prayed the divine office. I still welcomed visitors. But my steps were shorter. My voice, once loud from balconies, had become a quiet whisper. The world kept moving. Wars continued. Church meetings happened. The poor still came to the door. And I stayed in my little room at Santa Marta, trying to hold all of them in my prayers. I often thought about Saint Joseph, the quiet one, the protector, the man who did everything God asked, then quietly disappeared from the Gospels. That's how I wanted to go, not with big farewells, just with peace. There was no final speech, no sign from the heavens, no big book of theology. Just breath, prayer, and silence. I died in the spring of 2025 with people I had chosen to walk with by my side. There was no crown for me to lay down, only a cross I had to carry one last time. I didn't pass as a prince of the church, but as a priest, a sinner, and a servant. My robe was white, yes, but under it, I was still Jorge, the kid from Flores who once swept floors in Cordoba. The news spread around the world. Pope Francis has died. Bells rang in Buenos Aires. Children lit candles in Manila. Bishops cried in Kinshasa. Migrants in Lampedusa held up pictures of us together. Some people mourned, some argued, some only remembered the hard parts. That was okay. A shepherd always carries the marks of his flock. People wrote about Laudato Si, the synods, the scandals, the feet I washed, and the doors I tried to open. Some thanked me, others didn't. That's how history works. No one walks alone. Every life is part of a bigger story. My voice was just one of many. The Curia started its traditions again. The sede vacante, the next conclave. The keys being passed. But I wasn't part of that anymore. My body was placed before the altar, not to be praised, but to bear witness. I asked that no statues be built, no titles made bigger. If anyone remembers me, let it be the poor. Don't remember my face. Try to remember the face of Christ I tried to show, even if I didn't always do it well. And if one word of mine stays with you, let it be this: mercy. It's stronger than rules, longer lasting than kingdoms. It's the one name God always listens to. Now I see everything. The mother crying in Syria, the kid smiling in a Roman alley, the nun praying in Madagascar, the young man who left the church but never gave up on love. I see the church, not as the world reports it, but as it truly is. Broken and beautiful, hurt and holy, still trying to follow the path to the kingdom. I see Christ. He's walking ahead, always ahead. And I'm walking after him, limping, yes, but finally home.